Could both teams please write your speaker names and speaking order in the chat groups? And also, meanwhile, another thing is, with regards to POIs, would both teams prefer to be done in a verbal manner, or would you prefer in written format?
We prefer verbal.
Okay, how about New Zealand?
We're happy with verbal too, yes please.
Great. Great. So I assume also the coaches and observers are in the room as well. Great. Yes, without any further ado, I bring back the microphone to the chairperson.
May I now invite the first speaker from proposition to begin this debate?
Can you hear me all right? Can you hear me all right?
Yes, and with regards to timing, please time yourself. I'll try to indicate as much as we can, but great.
Our case in this debate is very simple. The system of private land ownership that has existed in much of the world for the past 1,000 years is responsible for most of the evils in our world today, including corruption, inequality, poverty, and racism. 3 things in this speech. First, I'll explain clearly what we support. Then, I'll argue that private land ownership is principally unjust and leads to unacceptable concentrations of wealth and power that impoverish much of the population. Thirdly, I'll argue that private land ownership leads to segregation, racial inequality, and conflict. First, what do we support? The wording of the motion makes it clear that this is not a policy debate. Instead, we are supporting a counterfactual world where, when deciding the system of economic rights to implement, societies choose our proposal instead of the current system of private land ownership. This debate is about whether that world is superior to the status quo. Second, how do we envision the regime mentioned in the motion working? We imagine that all land is owned by the state and is rented out on limited term contracts. The length of the contract will depend on the nature and size of the land. Every time a contract ends, an auction is held to determine the next renter of the property. People submit bids on how much rent they are willing to pay, and the highest bidder is selected and has to pay the rent to the government for the duration of their term. The total revenue from all rent payments in the country will go to the government and will presumably be used by the government to provide additional services, cover the taxes, and so on. Moreover, since the state has a strong interest in promoting infrastructure growth, we envision that the state will implement a tax which strongly rewards land renters for improving the value of their land. So, for example, if I rent a piece of land and then build a productive factory on it, which increases its rent value at an auction, at the end of my lease, I'll receive a large tax credit or payment from the government as a reward for constructing that factory. This is analogous to governments currently providing tax credits to companies that engage in investment or R&D. Conversely, if I degrade the value of the land, I'll be taxed by the government just like we currently tax people for harming the environment. I'll take a POI.
Point, sir. In your model, the only people able to construct land and make good things on it and be the highest bidder are the rich people. How are you changing anything in your model?
No, that is not true, because we have a market mechanism that allocates these prices at auction. There's going to be a range of these prices, but importantly, the government reallocates this money back into society through providing additional services from the rents gained. Now to my first point, on the injustice of private land ownership. The crucial context here is that the value of land tends to increase over time for 2 reasons. First, it increases when the owner of a piece of land improves its value by building on it, for example, by building houses or a factory. We think it's entirely fair and efficient that landowners are rewarded for this sort of thing, which is why we envision that governments providing tax credits for this development in our work. Secondly, and far more importantly, land increases in value even if the owner of the land does absolutely nothing to improve it, for three reasons. First, because the supply of land is fixed. Land becomes relatively more scarce as the population grows, which increases its value although the owner has done nothing. Second, economic growth leads to increases in productivity, which increase the value of land for potential buyers, even if the owner of the land does nothing. Third, the activities of other people increase the value of a piece of land, because if people build roads and houses near my plot of land, that makes living on my plot of land more attractive and increases its value even if I haven't done anything. Crucially, under a system of private land ownership, the owner of the land gets to collect all of the increase in value due to these processes, even though the landowner hasn't done anything to create value for society. By contrast, in our system, the value of all land is paid in rent to the state and then redistributed to citizens through the provision of services and tax cuts. The increase in value benefits everyone. Why is it bad that under private land ownership, all of the value accrues to the landlord? Three reasons. First, it is principally unjust. A small number of landowners capture a large percentage of economic growth and become massively wealthy, even though they do not work at all or contribute productively to society. Note that this land is also often initially acquired through acts of colonisation or theft, which means landowners do not even have a right to that property to begin with. Second, land ownership results in huge concentrations of wealth and power that are corrosive to democracy and to the operation of free and competitive markets. Land ownership creates a snowball effect as landowners earn huge rents, which they then use to buy more and more land and further increase their earnings. This leads to two problems. First, wealth becomes massively concentrated among a small number of landowners who use that wealth to seize the levers of power and corrupt democracy. Second, this gives landowners control over huge swathes of economic activity, since they control which companies are allowed to operate and build branches. This lets them create huge monopolistic companies that impoverish workers and consumers. This is what robber barons did in the US throughout the 19th and 20th century. It's what feudal lords did in Europe for 800 years, and it's what landowners in much of the world still do today. By contrast, what happens under our side? Entrepreneurial people who have good business ideas can still bid for plots of land and build productive businesses on them. But the rent earnings produced by land are paid to the state and redistributed to everyone, which means that no one becomes stupendously wealthy, and so the snowball effect can never take off. Society is much more economically equal. Wealthy people have less power to corrupt, and no one has the power to control economic activity in the market and remain free and competitive. Our second argument is that private land ownership leads to residential segregation, racial inequality, and conflict for several reasons. First, private ownership encourages and allows for fixed patterns of residential segregation that perpetuate racial inequality. It encourages a culture of owning a family home that you remain in across generations, which creates fixed white neighbourhoods that lock out minority ethnicities and means that members of those ethnicities lack access to good services and schools. By contrast, our model encourages movement and discourages attachment to particular locations because everyone's houses go up on the market every few years. This creates dynamic residential patterns where everyone moves around a lot, and therefore more racial and cultural integration is naturally achieved because initial racial patterns are not permanently locked in. Secondly, land ownership entrenches intergenerational racial wealth inequality. Both sides of the house probably get an initial racial wealth gap due to historical patterns of colonization. But under their side, white people are able to pass down their wealth through passing down the land they plundered from indigenous people. On our side, that wealth cannot be passed down because rents are paid and everyone is constantly forced to give up ownership of the land. This destroys the racial wealth gap, which destroys much present racial inequality. Thirdly, private land ownership is a primary driver of conflict and conquest because private landowners lobby the state to capture additional territory for their interests. History is full of examples of this. Lords in feudal Europe went to war to conquer the estates of other lords, and today private settlers in Israel encroach on Palestinian territory and force the Israeli government to follow. Crucially, under either side, governments have an incentive to go to war to capture land for themselves. That's symmetric. But their side has the additional lobbying influence of private land ownerships who are often tremendously powerful. We stand for a prosperous, equal, and free world without private land ownership. I'm so proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 3 seconds.
Guys, there's just one thing I need to get done with. I was a judge for Team Pakistan and I've not been allocated in this match. They asked me to obtain consent from both teams if I can watch this match. So are both teams okay with that? Thank you.
May we now have the first speaker from the opposition to begin to continue this debate?
Okay, am I audible?
Yes.
I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. When you give the state ownership of land, you make everything so much worse. Because let's take a look at the policy. Their option for renewals or getting the lease in the first place is the highest bid. Logically speaking, who gets that highest bid? It's the rich people, it's the corporations, it's the private firms that they so demonized on their side. The problem then is, within a bidding system, what's likely to happen is you have even more land up for grabs, which means if this is a problem in the status quo, where corporations are hoarding land, then you just give them even more land for them to bid on and for them to steal. The problem at side proposition that they try to highlight, which is corporations owning a lot of land, we think becomes so much worse when you have this policy. Then let's move on to the other ideas that they had. Firstly, in terms of value increasing, if people are productive on their land, they deserve to get the benefits of it. We completely agree, which is why we're giving them the fair compensation by letting them own land if that's the principle we're taking it. Secondly, on speculation, we think they make it even worse because they have 1, no caps because they've never maxed out their policy, and 2, no the bidding system. And given that that's the case, things like speculation of land, not using it productively, and giving the rich more land to steal, we think increases the inefficient use of land that you so loathe in the status quo. The only real principle they then had was unfair acquisition. I have a couple of rebuttals here. Firstly, on colonization, it's power plus authority. Only states have the power to do this, not the individual. And so we think it's the state's fault that this thing happened, not the individuals. If the states have changed, then past and present actors are no longer the same. Factors have changed. Then this should also apply to the individuals who have kept up with structures, not now, that have kept up with state structures to work hard and grow and sustain their wealth. So that's why we don't think the unfair acquisition plan means you take it away from individuals. Lastly, on residential segregation, we think it's the states that have perpetuated so much inequality. Let's talk about the Homestead Act, which allocated 10% of all land to white people while denying black people ownership. Things like state-sponsored redlining are all reasons for not why the private market did things, but it's because the state was sponsoring racial segregation. The same state, you're now giving ownership over these people's livelihoods. And secondly, movement is a terrible thing. It assumes fair distribution of land, which I'll prove won't happen. But things like your home security, things like your employment, your education, if you're moving around every couple of years, we think that creates massive instability for even the poorer class. You're not helping them. The state's an ineffective actor. What's my positive case? 2 arguments. 1, why is prop extremely disproportionate and people have the right to own land? Secondly, why will the state fail miserably and cause extreme harm? On proportionality, we showed how their need necessarily doesn't stand. But even if we concede some harms exist, we think the interference of the state has to be proportional and do not disregard the rights of the individuals, which side proposition recognizes are important to be compensated for. What are our alternatives? Firstly, you can have things like capping the prices of sales or lease, things like capping the total amount of land only in the most extreme cases where somebody owns half of a province. Thirdly, you can prevent or heavily tax people who sell land very quickly to disincentivize speculation. Or fourthly, you could build houses for the poor by purchasing land at a fair price and then cutting down on the state's use of land when they build things like huge governor houses. We think this is an important distinction because you don't take away everybody's rights because a few people abuse theirs. They're not making a policy for just the 1%. They're taking away land from everybody. You stop drunk driving, not drinking or driving. You don't take away the rights of people forever. We think this is in line with our conception of the state's responsibility, something that they never really told you about. We don't think the state has the burden to create absolute equality. It has the responsibility only to deal with excessive abuses of rights and provide everybody with basic necessities. We think they're already doing that in status quo, if not with alternatives. Why do people then have the right to own land? This is important given that the scale of change that proposition is bringing infringes so much on the individual's rights. Firstly, we think the individual has a right over their body and they own it. If that body has been used to put in effort and acquire something, then the ownership, we think, extends to that property. We think this applies to owning land. Humans put in not just physical, but mental labor. This is important because people have a right to own their land as an extension of their labor and effort. We think the state as an entity does not put in that labor the same way people do, and so cannot possess the same ownership. Secondly, association.
we think human beings' identity extends to their property. It's a reflection of a human personality, particularly as it applies to groups like, let's say, the Aborigines and African Americans, who've lived there for decades, if not centuries. As a nameless, faceless entity, the state cannot have the same association. Thirdly, the right to enterprise. We think everybody has a right to purchase land and benefit from it monetarily. Land can and should be treated just like any other asset that has the potential to benefit if people invest in it. We think the state is not an entrepreneurial body. It does not profit and cannot improve its quality of life, and so should facilitate its citizens in doing so. Fourthly, the right to sell and inherit. We think children are an important reason for earning money in the first place. Just like wealth, we think children should be able to inherit the property of their parents that they work so hard in. We think it's in line with the right of people to transfer their property. The state is not a living body. It's a social entity that evolves over time. We don't think it has the same right to transfer property. But given that those are all the principal reasons we have to deal with, what is our practical? Why don't we trust the state? Many reasons. One, we think it mainly comprises of the rich or the elite class that side proposition has such a problem with, because they have requisite capital to get into and hold political office. That means one, economic capital in terms of businessmen, executives who fund the lives and campaigns of politicians. Two, social in terms of social capital in terms of celebrities and athletes. And thirdly, political parties where now they're in power, but you're giving them absolute power over people's lives. Secondly, they have more of an incentive to care about those who have capital because they give them the most returns, as opposed to the poor, vulnerable, racially segregated people Prop wants to talk about. Thirdly, lobbyists give politicians seats on their directorates, like the Bush family was heavily involved in oil. And fourthly, as side proposition points out, entrenched racism and sexism, things like racial segregation, that is propagated by the state. If it takes everybody's land, the scale of exploitation, we think, is massive on multiple levels. One, for the most vulnerable, the poor minorities that both sides agree are probably one of the more important actors in this debate. The family that owns a small flat in a city center finally gets employment due to their location. You strip it away because, by their own words, you have to move around every couple of years. Why? Because the state would reallocate the rich and powerful to areas of peak economic gain, like urban centers, while the vulnerable are thrown into the outskirts. Their gains they made are gone up in smoke. They're likely to be locked out of any employment in your world. Secondly, on businesses, we think the state gives better leases to the elite because their interests align with them. So the economically strong who fund campaigns, which means they get larger portions of land. They get easier renewals. That is when accumulation happens. But even if accumulation happens on both sides, we think newer businesses, the one who employ tons of people, especially in poorer neighborhoods where other businesses just don't go, now don't have the grounds to go against these companies because they don't have the same lobbying power. And thirdly, agriculture is a source of food. There are two things that are going to happen. One, you have inefficient distribution and therefore less production, which means overall you cannot feed your populace. Two, you have overuse
The auction system exists on both sides of the house. Therefore, any poor people that you claim get cut off would surely also get...
No, because we think the middle class owns substantial portions of land within the status quo. We think now that it's up for grabs, the rich completely expand their control into that. So the piece of land that they own right now, you're taking that away too. We think that's the harm. Even if the state is good. One, the leasing system still favors the rich. They'll outbid everybody else, as I talked about. Secondly, bureaucracy. There's a lot of it on a national scale. They're prone to human error. And this human error is going to ruin people's lives, their livelihoods, and the association have with land. And also things like bribery and corruption, because the government necessarily doesn't pay the best. And thirdly, the history of marginalization already talked about. But let's talk to you about businesses. We think there are unique benefits of ownership that they gain on our side. One, in terms of mortgaging, we think it's easier to pay off because rent is subject to increase and cannot be paid off. Secondly, the need for a stable location. Relocation for businesses is really expensive. Thirdly, economic value, land acts as an equity for investors. Now, any improvement done by the business is owned by the state and doesn't go into the business. And fourthly, the ability to sublet businesses can rent out this spaces to other businesses. I think the impacts of this are that one, businesses can expand due to the full two, they're more efficient and economically productive, and therefore they can get more revenue for redistribution and employ more people. Because we think that their policy is principally abhorrent because it infringes to such an extent on individual rights. And because they cause such mass exploitation, we don't think in good conscience you can vote for side proposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 16 seconds.
We will now have the second speaker from the opposition to continue.
outside opposition wanted to win by proving to you that the wealthy just get wealthier on their side, totally ignoring how systems of wealth have been created. That it's one person managing to buy up a bit of land and accumulate capital on that land over time. That means you have entrenched power structures that allow, for instance, people to corrupt political institutions in the first place. We tell you at the point that you never allowed that initial accumulation. You do not have issues like mass-scale corruption. You don't have issues like mega businesses being able to buy up all the land in the first place. They simply wanted to tell you what would happen right now if you switch to this system. They never engaged with the fact this debate was about a world at the point that you engaged with this form of ownership from the very beginning. What am I going to do to you in this speech? First of all, I'm going to briefly go over why the auction system allows poor people to access property in greater amounts. Then I'm going to talk to you about state what obligation the state has to its people. Thirdly, what happens to the land, and then on to my split point about things like investment. First of all, they told you that the auction system is necessarily going to cut off the poorest individuals. We told you at first that this was wrong because of ideas of initial accumulation. We additionally tell you that, for instance, it's particularly hard to start up a business if you need things like collateral, which is found in the form of property, which oftentimes comes from parents. We tell you that it's things like children going to being able to take over parents' property at the point that their parent could just put that in a trust and give it to them after they die. We tell you what's going to happen under our side of the house is that these systems of auctions are going to be based rather on, for instance, how productive an individual thinks they can make their land. We think that when you don't have systems where businesses only give out loans to things like development to individuals who already own capital because of things like risk, we tell you they're going to go to the business proposals they think are going to be best. We tell you that poor people aren't going to be structurally cut out of this system because they're going to have access to things like redistribution, because now the state has increased capital to do things like provide education and to do things like provide proper healthcare, which means that poor people aren't systemically locked out. Additionally, there was this idea of what the state has a responsibility to do. They told you that a state has a responsibility to protect property rights for three reasons. First of all, a person has a right to their body, their physical, and their mental labor. They told you that the income that they earn from land is an extension of this. We acknowledge this, and this is why we were happy to do things. For instance, to let individuals have that additional benefit of improving the value of that land. We tell you they have a right to that. They do not have a right, for instance, to the value of land that gains from just being lucky enough to own a bit of land in a part of a city which the value of the rates were going up already. That was non-responsive to the stuff that Isaac brought you. Second of all, they told you they had a right to land because land is an intrinsic part of identity. We tell you it's simply untrue that at the point you remove property rights for everyone, that people have identities based on things like land. We tell you that's what's more likely is going to form identity based on peer groups, based on things like personal qualities, or based on certain like broad characteristics about their nation. We tell you what's going to, unlike on their house, we just get attachments to specific slices of land. Doesn't stand at the point the whole world changes. Thirdly, they told you they have a right to their enterprise. Again, we're perfectly happy with, for instance, if someone builds a factory, them earning the income off that factory. That was non-responsive. We tell you that this right still exists at the end. We brought you a sophisticated analysis at first about why people have a right to systems like redistribution. They have a right to extend these kinds of things. That wasn't responded to. We tell you have a right to take. People do not have a property right in this case. They don't have a right to property which doesn't benefit society writ large. Secondly, who has the land? Because they wanted to bring you some pretty big analysis about why states were particularly bad in the first place. First of all, some brief contextualization as to why states are going to adopt policies that are going to be most economic beneficial. First of all, we tell you that bureaucrats and people that run governments have an incentive to prioritize things like national income. Even in the worst cases, if a country is going to be corrupted in the first place, they're going to get more money out of that corruption at the point everyone is doing better. So even the worst actors have something bad to do. Secondarily, people want to have the legitimacy to rule at the point that we think that there's going to be broad diversity in the beginning with how land ownership runs, that individuals are going to notice that other countries have it better than them, and therefore feel that their government's acting wholly illegitimately, and thus vote them out of power or uprise against them. We tell you that's why we're seeing massive uprisings against systems of poor property ownership in places like sub-Saharan Africa in this moment. We tell you there's therefore an incentive on on governments to take up the best system for these people. Secondly, we tell you that they have that incentive acting upon them because governments are more like because governments need to prioritize again their capacity to rule infinitely. Second of all, then they brought you through three broad things of material. First of all, they told you that states were run by the wealthy and had social capture by those who were most importantly. Second of all, they're going to want to continue this capture so they can have cushy careers in things like oil markets. Again, as I proved to you in my introduction, these people just aren't going to exist in the first place. But second of all, at the point you get more enfranchisement from the poor by giving them these land rights, we tell you it's simply not going to be true at that point. That they can, for instance, that people can't, for instance, vote those particularly bad governments out, that they can't turn away from them. Thirdly, they told you that governments are going to be willing to propagate those things so they can benefit under systems of things like corruption. We tell you that's not true at the point that can't happen. Again, as I proved to you earlier. I'll take a POI right now if there is one.
As long as the state is still going to be prioritizing economic productivity and leasing land on the basis of that, why would it give it to a poor man who can only own 1 acre as opposed to a rich man who can have economies of scale over 400 acres?
Because what's going to happen is that poor individual now probably is far richer on our side of the house because they didn't exist in those systems. But additionally, that person is going to have better ideas, better ways to make that land more productive. We tell you governments are going to want to give that money to those individuals who are more productive rather than those that have that money in the bank, that have that existing capital in which they can prioritize things like collateral. And they brought you this other material about how it's really bad because the poor are going to have to leave their areas, and that's bad for those individuals. We tell you what's probably more likely to happen is individuals move between houses in a small neighborhood, not individuals having to totally uproot and move from city to city. We agree that in some cases people are going to have to leave their house. No analysis as to why this wasn't in similar communities. Second of all, they told you that you're going to have vulnerable businesses because you're going to have massive capture by the wealthiest businesses. We tell you probably what's far more realistic under their side of the house is that you're going to have more competition because you're not going to have those systems of capital gain. Now, I'm going to tell you about the split material, about why we get better investment. This is really crucial in today's debate because at this point, we tell you that governments are going to want to incentivize this and thus not be so bad. First of all, we get more incentive to investment in productive capital. We tell you right now is a appreciating asset that has a lot of money. This was told you by Isaac and agreed to you by side opposition. What this means is you get a really high yield, low risk asset, which disproportionately funnels money into it as investors want high returns but low risk. This is really bad because things like productive capital are really important in generating jobs and generating these kinds of things. At the point that people can't just shove their money into land, we tell you you're going to do things like invest in factories, invest in things that are going to earn them earn society money long term. Second of all, we tell you that governments have more capacity to invest in things for reducing taxes, create adverse incentives away from things like spending, but secondarily increase capital for things like government spending on education, which means more people are better off and more people are able to do things like engage in capital markets and engage in good jobs. Proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 15 seconds.
I thank the second speaker of proposition. May we now invite the second speaker of opposition to continue.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, let me just put on time. Should I start? Starting in 3, 2, 1. I really like the second proposition because second proposition concedes the vast majority of arguments. And I'll give you one small, glimpse of what they were saying. At first proposition, they said that look, we're going to end segregation because in the vast majority of cases, people are stuck in small neighborhoods, which call racial bias because African Americans live in ghettos and the white people live in economic hubs. To which we asked them, well, how are you going to lease the land to source economic hubs by your own characterization functions? To which second proposition said, oh no. they're going to have small movement between neighborhoods, ladies and gentlemen. How does that then end economic segregation? How does that end racial bias if people are literally moving in ghettos and switching homes in between them? Notice how their own argumentation is extremely reductive, with the endpoint set out to achieve are not being achieved, which is why they're just fracturing their case. I'll prove to you how in the first issue, they're only harming economically the poor even more, the primary secular proposition, and number two on principle are still unjustified, right? In the first issue, let's talk about their auction idea, right? They said that, look, we're going to start auctioning this land and people who can pay for it more will probably get it because we're talking about the highest bidder. Who will be the highest bidder in the market right now? I don't think it's going to be the poor person who can't afford, who's living on a 9-to-5 job and a day-to-day wage. I think in the vast majority, this is the highest bidder people who can pay for these things, people who are captains of industry, people who own a lot of market, own a lot of land already. That is to say that in the vast majority of cases, the only people who are going to get land in economic hub in their best case scenario are people who are extremely, extremely rich and people who can afford to buy this land. But number two, notice in the status quo, if you have bought some piece of land, that land is yours and yours alone. No one can force it out of you. So on the comparative then, even people who are living on the outskirts, if any government or any person wants to expand now, all they have to do is wait for the next 5 years when they can now bid in the highest auction. I don't see a poor person living in the ghettos being able to outbid someone who owns industry and is the captain of so many businesses. That automatically means that gentrification, means that getting people evicted from their homes will significantly increase when the people decide, oh well, they want to get this land now because they want to expand their companies. That's number one. But number two, notice how in the vast majority of cases, the poor will be unable to sustain themselves because they're being asked to make payments periodically and over time. That automatically means that anyone living on a 9-to-5 job will be evicted the instant that some tragedy happens, economic tragedy happens. The second thing they said was, oh, we're going to have entrepreneurship. And this is where they said people will be incentivized to make high risk investments. The second problem, I love her speech, will be incentivized to make high risk investments simply because they can't invest in land anymore. In the vast majority of cases, gentlemen, who is the most likely to take these high risk investments? People who are living on 9-to-5 jobs, people whose entire savings can only amount to them buying one home or making one business, or people who own multinational companies. That automatically means that in the vast majority of cases, entrepreneurship and new businesses will only pop up for people who had the ability to buy them in the very first place. That automatically means that poor people who could invest within low-risk businesses would potentially make their own communities better off by investing in a small shop or some small company can no longer do so, because the instant they do, 5 years later, they're going to say goodbye to it after they're successful, right? Because the person realizes, oh, well, this small market is pretty successful, I just outbid it and buy it off. That automatically means that the poor people have no economic benefit or incentive in the long run. The third thing they said was that of economic security. And this is a comparative reason. Even if you were to concede that the middle class has significantly lower land in the upper class, notice how they still have land. That is to say, in the vast majority of cases, people who were minorities, women, generally have fought with the oppressive systems and fought back to get their rights and fight their stand. This form of financial security that exists in our model no longer exists in team proposition's case, simply because all land is being leased by the government. To which they conceded to by saying, oh, well, politicians have an incentive to prioritize national development. I love her speech. Where does national development come from? Does it come from the poor farmer who will own one plot of land, or the person who's willing to make a bloody industry on that land and have employ 1,000 people? That automatically means that the vast majority of cases, or the best kind of land that can profit and get even better, is probably going to belong to the rich. Before I move on, yes, ma'am.
Sir, the reason that rich people under the status quo buy land is because they can earn huge capital gains having not developed it, and because they can earn huge rents. We take that away onto our side of the house. Why is all the land going to be bought up by rich people?
Because you yourself said that if a rich person buys land and develops it, the government is going to give him things like tax credits. The government is going to give him things like rewards. He's going to be able to sell it at a higher auction because now that land is developed. That automatically means that in the vast majority of cases, they have incentive to develop the land, make an industry on it, or either sell it off in auction or re-auction it themselves and continue their industry. But number two, if I concede to your analysis, that automatically means that rich people no longer have incentive to expand their company, to expand their communities. Who do these companies benefit? People who are willing to get employment, the lower class. That automatically means that jobs from MNCs and all of these things are also negated in your model as well. Which brings me to the second issue, that on principle. And notice how they dropped the vast majority of their case. Like colonization is completely dropped. We told you how if your argumentation literally is unjust acquirement of land and colonization, notice how that happened. under the government's ambit in the vast majority of this. And now you're telling me that the same government who was neglected, the same government who prioritized people who were white or prioritized people who were rich, are now the people in control of this land, are now the people in power of this land. We don't think you're making unjust acquisition any better. But we told you how people don't have an inherent right to land. They have a right to shelter, which is why our alternatives make more sense in the instance where we're providing them things like subsidized housing, we're providing them things like tax subsidies and stuff like that to the poor. That automatically means that people don't have a right to land. They are still being provided a right to shelter, and are already fulfilling the government's responsibility. But number two, I say, this is not how you have equitable redistribution if that's your argument. If your argumentation literally is access, then give the same land to everybody and not have it on lease. But number two, you can potentially sell a Mercedes from a rich person and give like 10 people a motorcycle. But you don't do that in Cisco because you realize that people have a right to own their land and enjoy the fruits of their labor, even if that is through inheritance. That automatically means that the vast majority of principal argumentation is still left unrefuted. Let's add on to that in my positive case. I'll tell you how it gives the government way too much power to exploit the people. In two major ideas. Number one, I say that now the state is in a position to exploit individuals' necessity and bargain for land. Why so? Because by your own characterization, the vast majority of governments, especially in the third world, are corrupt. They can now use land leasing and redistribution as a way of gaining more votes and gaining more political control and gaining more political power. That is to say that governments will only focus this land leasing to people who are the economic, who are the voting support for a strong voter basis. But this also means that new governments put support in new people. That is to say you have a constantly changing economic hub and instability. And it's disgusting for the government to prioritize people's homes for the sake of their own political gains. We have seen examples of this when governments have like things like prioritize people like local vendors or people like army projects, or how the government of India prioritize their own Indian people in buying land in Kashmir because they want to further their own political interest. We think in that instance, you're only making worse off for minorities and for the poor people who want to protect. But number two, I say, principally speaking, this is an independent principle argument. A person's private property is generally their last line of defense against the state. That is to say, in the vast majority of cases, because people and the state respects the right to property, they don't intervene in a person's private space and person's private matter unless it's absolutely necessary. That is to say, that the same minorities, the women you want to protect, the African Americans you want to protect, whose homes were their last line of defense against an oppressive state, you're taking that away from them. That automatically means the government can now hold you in leverage. They can tell you where do you live, how to live, when to live, how long to live for, and when to leave. That kind of power to the government is automatically means that in an instant the government is oppressive, in an instant the government is racist, that automatically means you're disproportionately harming the poor even more, you're harming them even more. We have given you four principal ideas, the first in my first figure and another one in my second speech, to prove to you why principally a government that is racist, that is colonialist, should not be given this much power and take away the right, the property and liberty of so many people. Extremely proud of this.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 15 seconds.
I thank the speaker for the speech. May I now invite the third speaker from the proposition to continue.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
The current world private land ownership has led to unjust systems is a world where large landowners hold massively unequal amounts of wealth. It is a world where the subsequent monopolies can exploit and extract value from lower classes, and it is that world that opposition stands for today. I'll be bringing you 2 points of clash in the speech. Firstly, the impact of inequality, and secondly, the efficacy of the state. We're going to begin by talking about the impact of inequality. We believe this is the most important point in this debate, and we believe that we can win this debate if we tell you how our side of the house sees much less inequality and much fairer results for all people. Similarly, opposition wanted to win this debate by telling us how land hoarding increases, therefore increasing inequality. Let me tell you why that isn't true. Opposition has parroted constantly throughout their speeches the idea that rich people will buy all the land, that rich people will lock out all the poorer people, and that this just leads to much larger inequality under our auction system. Look,
Exactly on this point.
I told you. I'm sorry, what was that?
Point, sir.
No, thank you. We told you that the reason rich people buy land in the status quo is because all land earns them money. even if undeveloped. The reason for this is that economic growth just leads to land appraising in value, even if there's no development on it at all. What we heard from opposition at first and second is that rich people just do all of the development, and they gave a few reasons for this. Firstly, they said that rich people will just have more money so they can buy out all of these auctions. The issue with this is that there's not as much incentive for the rich to buy all of this land at the point where they can't develop all this land, because obviously rich people can't develop all the land in the world. This is an incredibly large amount of land, and there is absolutely no way rich people can actually afford to develop all this land at any reason. Secondly, we tell you on this that historically, the reason there are so many rich people in existence is because of this historic system of private land ownership that's led to inheritances where large sums of wealth are just passed down, leaving people getting richer and richer. At the point where those systems are removed from the get-go, we do not see these massively rich people. We don't see this happening in the first place, and therefore we don't see the problems coming from it as a result. Thirdly, on this, we tell you that market economy means that there is a range of prices available to poor people. The fundamentals of a market economy means that there will be land will be priced according to the people that want to buy them. Not only will rich people get land that is priced for them, but middle class and lower class people will also get land that is priced correctly for them. This is how a free market economy works, and it is something that we have faith in to adequately distribute land to all people. What else did we hear from opposition on this then? They told us that rich people would, it was telling when second opposition responded to our POI by saying that all this land would just be developed because of our tax credits. Look, we tell you that rich people simply do not have the means to develop all of this land, and we tell you that at the point where the rent from all of this land is gone, there is no incentive for them to purchase all of this land. All this benefits the middle class because any development will benefit the middle class, and secondly, all the money that comes out, all the money that is paid to the government will still benefit the middle class. So ultimately, we still see the middle class benefiting. Secondly, on this, they told us that poor people will just get screwed over by the auction system. Again, we tell you that the systems of inheritance that have led to all of these problems occurring in the first place will mean that the issues that lead to these things do not exist anymore. Lastly, then, they told us the vulnerable will be moved around, reducing ability to settle and succeed. We told you at second that this wouldn't be an issue, as the movements would be relatively minor still. Their reply to this was that, but these minor movements don't solve inequality. Well, directly, it doesn't, but let's look at how everything else does. What we see on our side of the house is, firstly, we see that that the systems of power that led to gains do not exist. Secondly, we see that the free market allows for more people to get the properties that they desire. And lastly, we see that inequalities are drastically reduced at the point where rich people cannot simply hoard all of the land just because it earns them money. Tax credits do not just let rich people develop all the land. This is very important to understand. I'll take you on a POI.
Other forms of accumulation will still exist on your side in forms of stocks, businesses, and historic racism. They still have capital and there's still rich people in your world. Given that that's the case, all the harms of accumulation apply even more when these people have unrestricted access to land and you take away land from people who already own it, people in the middle class.
Firstly, we're not taking away any land because this system is implemented from the very start. It's not a policy that we're implementing right now. Secondly, we tell you that these richer people there'll be much less of them on our side of the house because ultimately, historically, property has been how people have gained all of this money in the first place. At the point where this is removed, the distribution of wealth is far more spread out. Let's move on now to our second point of clash, the efficacy of the state. Opposition has told us the state is completely untrustworthy and cannot be trusted with distributing land. What have they told us on this? Firstly, they told us the state will align with corporate interests and merely serve big business. We tell you that corporate interests are less powerful at the point where auction systems lead to more competition. The reason for this is that auction systems mean that more people get a say in buying land. It also means that the larger distribution of wealth from a lack of historical property means that no individual company has all the monopolistic power to purchase all of this land. What we see is that the government will not be aligning with corporate interests in this way. Secondly, on this, they told us the state is often corrupt and will designate land
Points,
in line with political interests. We tell you that designating the land is not something that a state can do, but before I explain this, I'll take another view.
If your
If you're
argument
arguing
is that politicians support national development, why do you not have a direct incentive to align with corporate interests?
I will actually explain this now. We believe that corporations, firstly, believe in the free market to adequately get the best economic results in the long term. The reason for this is that corporations generally seek only short-term benefits, especially in this situation. But governments generally look at longer-term situations, and ultimately the free market is how this happens. Secondly, we tell you that governments are more interested in our model because it's a bureaucratic nightmare for the government to go around and listen to corporations on every plot of land. It's a nightmare for the government's corruption to go around and allocate land to every single person in the way that opposition believes they will. We don't see that something that the government would do simply because it's practically impossible. At the end of this, we see that the state will trust in the free market to provide the adequate assignment of land to all people. But most importantly, we see two things. Firstly, we see massively decreased inequality because the fundamental systems of power that led to mass wealth gathering no longer exist. And secondly, we see that many of the harms that opposition presented on their side do not exist at the point where all of this is not a policy change. It is a world that has existed since the very beginning, and it is a world that all people have come to accept as normal. This avoids many of their harms, and we see only reduced inequalities. Very proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for exactly 8 minutes.
I thank the speaker for the speech. May I now invite the third speaker from the opposition to continue.
Sorry, before you begin, another of your mics appears to be on. If you don't shut that down, there will be interference. So just make sure everybody that's not speaking mute themselves.
Am I audible now?
Yes, but the other, yeah.
I'm just opening my time. Just a second.
The second speaker from your team is also unmuted. So if that could, if they could mute themselves, that would be great.
Before the issues on this page, just some extraneous rebuttal to new ideas in third prop. The most interesting one is that this is not a retrospective debate. This will happen from the start of civilization. Note crucially that this should not be coming in third prop, but most importantly, most of the harm will done now, not stand. If it's happening when the start of civilization, they cannot retrospectively argue colonization. They cannot retrospectively argue holding and accumulation. They cannot then retrospectively argue acquisition that came from these things. Insofar as they cannot retrospectively argue colonization, they cannot argue that there is a reason for why land should be distributed this way. This debate is clearly about everything that's happened up till now and what you need to do after that. If it was anything else, it should have been up there at first proposition. The second idea that they're trying to argue that rich people are just going to die out because you're taking away land. You point out you still have things like stocks, you still have things like gold, you still have investing into other assets that are more short term. So if they do not have land, they will buy 12 cars to still accumulate that assets into property that can be given off to their children. Insofar as these things still exist and these people still own MNCs that make most amount of revenue, they'll still be the richest of the richest, there'll still be wealth inequality. They never had on tackle this. The third interesting thing that the proposition says is rich people cannot develop all land, which is why they do not have an incentive to get all land because they can no longer leave it be. Insofar as we prove that they own the vast majority of land, that means that the land is most easy to develop and most profitable is still with the rich people.
As long as the land that is most easy to develop and profitable is still with the rich people, the land that is left for the poor and the middle class is the one that is harder to develop. Here's where I love their policy. We're gonna punish people if the land's value goes down. When you have land that is really, really hard to develop, that you're not gonna be easily be able to profit off of, and you have a policy that's gonna punish people for having that land and not being able to develop it, we don't think middle class are the type of people who are gonna be able to own that land. That necessarily means on a comparative, the type of people who still find it easier to this land, if not develop it to the nth degree, but comparatively develop it more than the middle class, is still going to be your rich class. Why? Because it's cheaper for them to develop it. They benefit from the economies of scale. So if I have a 100-acre farm that's already giving me profit, I can reinvest that. Poor people cannot do that. That proves to you consistently that their own policy is a reason for why most amount of land, there is no cap on their leasing, goes to rich people, to wealthy people who can benefit off of economies of scale. Insofar as that is true, inequality is not being solved. That said, two issues of this debate. One on the access of land, two on the principle that they completely drop Shajid's argument about self-defense and how private property is a prerequisite to your democratic rights materializing, because otherwise state can literally shut you down whenever you want, completely stands. But I will wait up in the end. Firstly, the access. Over there, say we're going to end accumulation. We respond by saying you still have bidding and your own policy. They say, no, state has an incentive to increase revenue. We give you the argumentation about economies of scale, to which Third Rob responds by saying rich people cannot develop land. Note how that is already fallen. What do I then add? I then add that poor people cannot be productive for these three reasons. A, they do not have economies of scale. B, the land is just the one that is not valuable to begin with, i.e. because of lobbies, because of state's political incentives, because of state prejudices, good land still goes to superior races that the state considers to be superior. We said at that point the land that they have is one that they still have to pay constant lease for, that they still have to be punished for, but they cannot profit off of. Also note crucially, they do not have the fiat of saying that poor people will just have more technology or subsidies to develop land. Insofar as that is true, we think that these poor people will still not have tractors if it's a farmland. They still not have the best technology industries if that is true. If that is true, that they still cannot benefit off of their policy greatly. This shows to you that access to land is something they do not create. But most importantly, I want to ask them, if access was their end point, then why is this a bidding and lease system? Why is this not free distribution? I say this because on the comparative in the status quo, all over the world, 20 to 30% of land is owned by states in most countries. Insofar as that is true, free distribution of land, building affordable housing, capping prices, alternatives present at first crop that are more proportional and do not take everyone's rights away are still better that they have not engaged with. We clearly win access then. The second thing I want to talk about within this issue is that of risk. Note this directly clashes with their argument about low high risk investment. We say that the risk is always going to be greater for the middle class, given that they have more limited amount of resources. If I want to start a business, I have like only a few $1,000. I'm going to invest that into buying a space, because even if my business fails, I can get that value back by selling that apartment or that small piece of land into the free market. Their policy does not create this security, because notice their policy is relying on an unreliable actor that historically screwed over these people, i.e. these people will be depending on the state to reward them. Given the characterization of state that we've shown to you and the distrust that people have in the state, we don't think this policy is able to provide that security. Insofar as this policy is not able to provide that security, and at the same time they're punishing these people, which is a greater disincentive for them to not invest, we say what are the impacts of this? This means you have less SMEs, i.e. small scale, middle scale businesses. Insofar as you have less SMEs, the middle class that you are trying to benefit and give social mobility to are the ones who suffer. Because note crucially that the land was the safest form of investment that they can rely on to make this investment, get loans through collateral. We say then that the impact then means that you have less employment for people where there's these like SMEs like operate, i.e. middle class, lower middle class labor. This then shows to you the argumentation about risk disproportionately impacts poor and middle class people, decreases their social mobility and harms them in the long run. Their endpoint of social mobility and intergenerational inequality then does not stand. Why do we think that it's far worse in their model? Because we think even if people make investment, they make it in a short-run manner. Because they rightfully point out that you're going to be punished if the land value goes down. In our model, you know that even if the land value goes down, you still own that land. After 15 years, you do not have to give it away. You can still work on it and build that value back, which is why you have an incentive to make long-term investment. Their model is the one which supports short-term investment. Notice the impact of this. It is very crucial to the greater economic productivity. We say that they are the ones who are supporting and incentivizing unsustainable use of land, i.e. overgrazing in farms, i.e. the land's value in the long term falling, but you're getting some short-term incentive out of it. Conclusively, that shows that people who are able to take risks are people who are still rich. It strengthens rich monopolies, takes away middle-class businesses that can break them. They're losing this debate. On to the principle and why that's important. Shajil's argument is paramount in this debate and has not been engaged with for two major comparatives. We say there's a certain harm of the state having all power versus only a potential of benefit relies on state being a good actor. Regardless of whether or not state is a good actor or not, you're taking away people's rights. It's a certain harm versus potentiality of benefit. Secondly, we say they've completely dropped the colonization principle when we told you that there is no redress. Even if colonization happened and middle class people suffered, given that you're giving land to the state and not freely distributed to the middle class people, there's no redress on that principle. And insofar this idea of not doing anything is concerned, and that's why people should not have ownership, we say even when you're not doing anything, you invest in land, you take the risk of the land value falling, you deserve to get benefits of it. If that policy concedes to this, the logical extension of that is ownership. Lastly, we say price discrimination can still be fought by viability of alternatives that we've talked about. State discrimination is something people cannot fight for opposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 20 seconds.
I thank the speaker for his speech. May I now invite the reply speaker from the opposition to close their case.
Am I audible?
Yes.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. This might sound repetitive, but I also like third proposition to speak a lot. Because third proposition says that, oh, we're talking about this retrospectively. So the question then becomes, the same states that legalize or incentivize or were negligent to things like colonization, but negligent to things like genocide, i.e. past Germany, old colonial era Britain, are the same states that you're now going to give complete ownership of land. So right now in the free market system, by your own beck and call, people only have to fight things like financial issues. Now they have to fight a racist, sexist, politically motivated state in order to obtain land. On a comparative then, retrospectively, third proposition, still engagement by third op and reply as well, that retrospectively, you're only making it worse for the same minorities who ought to protect simply because now they have to fight state biases as well as the financial hardships they're already facing, which means it's impossible for them to ever climb the social ladder. I really like that idea. Thank you for adding on to our case. The three issues is to be boiled down, right? The issue of access, the issue of social mobility, and that on principle. In access, they said that, oh, look, the free market system has created so much insecurities and so much inequality that we're going to give it back to the free market system again. But this time, it's going to be through leasing and auction. That's excellent. That's an excellent policy to run because in the free market system, people who have the most money get the most opportunities, they get the most land, they get the most product. That is to say that in the vast majority of cases, if someone is literally building an industry in the central New York or in Manhattan, I don't see any poor person being able to buy that piece of land or set up a phone over there. In the vast majority of cases, the only people who can actually get it is going to be people who are actually doing it well. But if your argument literally is that the value for land is always increasing, and why are you rewarding the people who are increasing this value of land? Then automatically means the people who are rich, who have areas and economic hubs, who have fertile land because they're able to pay for it more, generally increase the value for land even more and will derive even more benefit out of it. That automatically means on a comparative, in the best case, the only land the poor people are going to get is that on outskirts, and that only for a limited period of time until the rich decide to gentrify that as well, because 5 years this they can buy it off a few years later. That automatically means that you do not have free and equitable distribution to, by the way, your own endpoint of access. But at the same time, our alternatives of having free shelter or subsidized housing are automatically more proportional and automatically more effective. We think we win access. The second thing I said was that on social mobility. We've already proven to you how high risk investments are only afforded by the upper or the elite class. That is to say that the poor and middle class, whose only form of investment was in this safe and secure land, which they would trust in because the price of land always increases, is now going down the drain. They have no opportunity to gain any social mobility because they can't set up a business. They can't own any more land and hope for its price to increase simply because they can't buy it anymore. That automatically means they can't save their money and they're likely to never have any form of social mobility. But it also means that large MNCs who have an incentive to invest will either invest more and monopolize land, and if they don't have an incentive in proposition best case, then they will not expand their community, they will not expand their companies. This means less jobs for the poor, less security for the poor, less services for the poor. Economies of scale means less products for the poor as well. That automatically means you're still disproportionately harming the poor, even on social mobility. They will never be able to make things better. What, right? We say, lastly, the idea on principle, and this was crucial for them to win this debate because I've already proven how middle class owners are already going to be harmed in social mobility. But on principle, we give you 4 principal attacks. Number 1, that people in general have a right to the fruits of their labor, even if that means they can give this wealth off to someone they trust, like their next of kin. Number 2, we said that people uniquely have the ability to associate with that. Number 3, we said that people uniquely have the ability to invest and have the right to entrepreneurship. We also told you that the state, being a social construct, cannot have these rights and hence cannot own land or at least excessive amounts of land or all of the land in the country. But number 4, we told you this in the vast majority of cases, the only form of protection for people who are being oppressed, for minorities against the state, all of which was left unrefuted. Their own principal argument of colonization was dropped, and retrospectively speaking, it's only worse off in their model. That automatically means that you win on all 3 grounds. We are very happy to do this.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 17 seconds.
I thank the speaker for his speech. May I now invite the reply speaker from the proposition to close their case.
Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Panel, what is crucial to recognise at the end of this debate is that this debate was not about implementing a policy in 2020. It was about an entirely different conception of the world when we started with this idea of state ownership of land as we have modelled. That is so important in today's debate because so many of side opposition's arguments are contingent on this policy being implemented now. Because when we tell you that it's implemented over the last thousands of years, that means that we're no longer ripping land away from individuals. That means that no longer individuals have grown such an attachment to one piece of land because they're constantly changing. And it means that huge inequalities in wealth don't exist, which we have proven right down the line are deep-rooted in the idea of land ownership. 3 points for the House. Firstly, whether state ownership of land is principally justified. Secondly, whether state ownership of land results in less inequality. And thirdly, what are the implications for economic efficiency? Firstly, let's take a look at this principle, because we gave you really good responses to their material about why individuals should be able to benefit from their land. But they brought up as second op that private land is the last line of defence against state power as a new principal extension. We tell you that this is just unrealistic in today's debate because firstly, in democracies, rights still exist and there's still pressure on the government to abide by these rights, otherwise they'll get voted out. But secondly, in a dictatorship, we think that infringement on liberties exists on both sides of the house because owning a piece of land does not stop dictators arresting you, persecuting you, or rigging elections. That principle falls out of this debate. What we brought you on our side of the house was that it's principally unjust for individuals to benefit from increases in the value of land when the owner does absolutely nothing to improve it. We did not hear adequate response from side opposition. This is still standing in today's debate. Our stance is principally justified. Second clash, whether state ownership of land results in less inequality. We told you that state ownership reduces residential segregation, reduces intergenerational wealth inequality, and reduces conflict, which ultimately entrenches poverty for some people. We did not hear adequate responses from side opposition. But what did they tell us? They told us, and they hung their entire case on this claim, that poor people cannot access any land when the state owns land and uses an auction system as rich people just buy it. 3 responses that we've given you right down the line. Firstly, there's less inequality in the first place, meaning that there's not the same ability for those rich people to buy the land. We've proven that we reduce the intergenerational inequality. Secondly, there's a reduced incentive for rich people to buy large property portfolios when they know that they're not able to earn rents from this or capital gains from this if they don't do any productive development. But thirdly, we tell you that an auction system has a range of prices for different qualities of properties. This is just how a free market mechanism works, meaning that some will be at the higher end, some will be at the lower end. People are happy. Why is this material about us reducing inequality enough to win us the debate? Firstly, because we've said that it's principally unjust that inequality exists. We win on that. But secondly, we tell you that inequality reduces social cohesion, because what we're seeing in the US with like mass rioting and protests at the moment is a result of intergenerational oppression of African Americans. But thirdly, we tell you that it ultimately impacts the economic development of a country. Because although we've proven that we do get better economic outcomes because we reduce monopolistic industries and we get more government spending on things like welfare and infrastructure progress, we think that inequality directly links to economic efficiency, because when you uplift the population, when you get them working productively, more highly skilled, more educated, you get a more productive society. So proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 8 seconds.
Thank you everyone for the most enjoyable debates. Can we ask everyone to wait patiently in this room as the judges deliberate? Judges will return to this room at the end of their deliberation to deliver the results. Thank you everyone.
Thank you.